Tonight, almost 20 people die every day waiting for an organ transplant. What are 5 Yale students doing to help? Stay tuned to find out.
It has been nearly 2 years since Marina Keegan's final piece of writing, The Opposite of Loneliness, got over 1.4 million views online. Keep watching to learn more about what made this Yale grad great.
Stay tuned for these stories and more. It's your Yale, your week, and your news. Hello and welcome to YTV. I'm Raleigh, Cavero.
And I'm Michael Leopold, filling in for Madison, Alworth. Today is April 11th, 2014.
To begin, we'll go to reporter Stefina Yulee in the newsroom for this week's headlines.
Thanks. Employment controversy at Yale usually involves staff members, but this week, news broke surrounding a different group of Yale workers, student employees. Currently, half of all wages paid to student employees come from the Provost's office in subsidies, with the other half paid by employers. But in an email, Provost Benjamin Polak said that this will change beginning next year. A new wage match program will only apply to students receiving need-based financial aid and earning $15 per hour or less. Polak says the change is meant to return the program to its original mission of encouraging employers to hire students with financial need. And it turns out students aren't the only Yale employees in the headlines this week. For the second time in 6 months, the university has been sued in a case concerning workplace discrimination. In a suit filed in February, former employee Karen Curcio claimed that she was dismissed after refusing to fire a coworker based on that coworker's disability. Curcio, who was an associate administrator at the School of Nursing, says that after refusing to comply, she was fired by her superior, Nuno D'Onofrio, in July of 2011. While still employed, Curcio brought her concerns to university administrators, who have denied that any wrongdoing occurred. The suit is still in the process of moving through Connecticut court. Elsewhere on the legal front, it has now been 3 months since Sarah Short filed a lawsuit against 86 current and former members of Sigma Phi Epsilon in connection to the 2011 Harvard-Yale tailgate accident. That group is now responding. The response, which was submitted by attorney Jeremy Pladek, was filed on behalf of the entire group of defendants and argues that the suit should not hold each member of the fraternity responsible for the incident. The 84 defendants have filed a motion to have their cases consolidated with Sarah Short's suit against Brendan Ross. As the SIGAP lawsuit drags on, the divestment debate on campus is heating up once again. A pair of student-led protests in the past 2 weeks has rekindled divestment discussions on campus. And last week, the Yale Corporation may have fanned the flames when it decided to postpone its decision on whether the university should divest from fossil fuel companies. Back in February, the Advisory Committee on Investor Responsibility, a group of 8 professors, students, and alumni committed to divestment, presented to the corporation on the issue. When the two sides met again last week, the corporation said it needed more time to consider the decision. And that's it for this week's headlines. Back to you in the studio.
Thanks. 5 students and professors from Yale's Center for Engineering Innovation and Design have created an intestinal preservation unit. It's the first device ever invented to help safely transport intestines for transplants.
That breakthrough, they hope, will make these transplants more available to those in need. Joseph Vinson and Lily Rivkin take a closer look.
We're used to this. But what about this? Fragile human intestines. It's not your everyday post office traffic for sure, but for 120,000 people across the United States every year, transporting an intestine can be a matter of life and death.
Intestine is the organ that it's most rarely transported, and so this is the biggest concern for doctors. Kidneys, heart, and liver have a good way of being transported, but the small intestine is tricky.
Intestines aren't just fragile. Organs are often difficult to transport, but among them, intestines are notorious because their tissue breaks down at such a fast pace.
It's not like a kidney or, liver, but it's this really long, sort of cumbersome organ to work with. and it's very susceptible to, cell injury during like transport between.
Typically, there is a window of only 8 hours to get an intestine to someone in need. The most common cause of intestinal failure is short bowel syndrome, and if a patient does not receive a transplant, they will not be able to absorb water, vitamins, and other nutrients from food to sustain life. But 5 innovative Yale students have designed a groundbreaking new transportation unit to solve this problem.
So we did most of our work in the Yale Center for Engineering, Innovation, and Design because that's where our class was held. So we got a lot of resources from the engineering department.
Our co-teacher was Dr. Richard Fan, who's now at Stanford. But they were great mentors for us throughout the class.
All of our prototyping from like our first models all the way up to like our second and third.
The idea of an intestinal preservation unit came from Professor John Geibel. He believed that improving transport would better ensure the intestines worked effectively once implanted.
So we tested two different versions of our prototype in 2 different experiments using a pig intestine.
After 2 trials with pig intestines, results show that their new transportation unit significantly improved the quality of the tissue in comparison to a standard cooler. In other words, they had discovered the first transportation solution for intestines.
Our container is basically a cooler with 2 pumps inside of it that perfuses a special solution through the intestine. So not only through the intestine, but also through the vasculature, which are the blood vessels associated with the intestine. And so it keeps the solution running for 8 hours within 4 to 8 degrees, and it keeps the viability of the organ high during transport.
The 5 students are graduating, but they plan to transport their project with them beyond Yale's walls.
So we're all graduating, but we have a provisional patent in the works, and so hopefully it can be licensed to commercial companies in the future.
Moving from the lab to the medical clinic, this project has the potential to change lives nationwide and across the globe.
I've been working with organ procurement organizations, which are organizations that organize organ transplant. And so we would definitely roll it out, regionally first, test it out regionally, and then expand it nationwide.
This has been Lily Rivkin and Joseph Vinson for YTV.
In May, the group will present their work to the Society for Surgery of the Alimentary Tract. It's the world's leading educational forum for those working in gastroenterology and other related fields.
With commencement just around the corner, many Yale students are worried about learning how to properly deal with their finances after Yale. Liberal arts schools often come under fire for not offering a practical education in dealing with personal finances. But is this claim really true? Reporter Stephanie Yulee and Kristen Mendez tell us more.
At present, Yale College only offers 1 course on financial accounting. This semester, it was canceled, leaving Yaleys scrambling for other ways to gain financial literacy. Even though the number of finance classes are lacking, what many don't know is that Yale offers multiple financial literacy forums outside the lecture hall. But many remain undersubscribed and even undiscovered. This past week, not 1, but 2 forums were held on financial literacy.
I hear a lot of complaints about the liberal arts education, how people feel that they're not getting practical skills, anything marketable, difficult to find jobs, function after graduation, stuff like that. So we sort of came up with this and this curriculum in response to students.
And though this was done in response to students' needs, there were only 30 students present. The talk covered skills ranging from managing a checking account to navigating the student loan process. Over half the attendees were seniors.
I think one of the biggest problems is that people need to be more aware of it. So far as general undergraduates go, I think we have trouble realizing that these things do pertain to us.
Similar opportunities are offered surprisingly often. Just 3 days later, Steve Bloom, class of 74, the director for strategic initiatives at the Association for Yale Alumni, held a master's tea that gave students a crash course on important finance skills for new college grads.
If you simply take your money and, figuratively speaking, put it under a pillow, you will succeed in saving money, but you probably will fail in reaching your life goal, which would be enough money to meet your needs during your lifetime, during retirement, medical needs, and so forth. So, as Yogi Berra should have said, but never did, the biggest risk is taking none.
The reaction was positive, and the students we spoke to seemed to feel more assured about entering the real world after the talk.
There were a lot of words that I had heard before and didn't quite understand what the difference between an IRA and a Roth IRA is. and now I feel like I have a really good handle on these sorts of things.
Well, it was a really good way to get some rules of thumb about how to budget your spending and more long-term stuff like retirement.
It's things like this that without someone who has had a lot of experience in the field, it could be hard to get into, and you might stumble unnecessarily without his advice.
The fact that we've dropped our unemployment rate from, say, 10% to roughly 6 or 7% really doesn't change the essentials. It still boils down to figuring out what should a budget look like, how much of it is discretionary, how much of it is non-discretionary, how can I flex that to defend the place that savings take place in it, and then how do I create a plan that goes out years or even decades, although that seems like a long time.
Any student, any Yale undergraduate, whether or not you're on financial aid or not, can walk into the Student Financial Services office and get advice. If they can't advise you themselves, they will direct you to the appropriate resources.
No matter where you're headed after Yale, financial literacy is an important skill to have for existing outside of these ivy-covered walls. Yale offers outlets for learning such skills, and if students seek them out, they can make their transition to independent living a much smoother ride. This has been Kristen Mendez and Stefina Yuli reporting for YTV.
Even more opportunities for improving financial literacy may be in the works for Yaleys. The YCC is currently considering expanding this series of forums to full-fledged workshops with complete curriculums and more structured teaching.
And in graduation season, we also think back to commencement 2 years ago. 5 days after graduating from Yale in 2012, Marina Keegan died in a tragic car accident.
The graduate was a student, friend, and writer who left behind many memories, and also many stories.
Wednesday night, members of the Yale community gathered with English professor Ann Fadiman for a reading of Keegan's most memorable essays. They were compiled in her newly released book, The Opposite of Loneliness. Here are a few highlights from that event.
The title of the book comes from an essay Keegan published in the 2012 graduation issue of the Yale Daily News, just days before she died in a car accident in Cape Cod. Keegan's parents, Kevin and Tracy Keegan, alongside her writing professor Ann Fadiman, selected the essays and stories from the countless pieces Keegan had saved on her computer over the course of her short but prolific writing career. Roughly 80 people showed up to the book launch, one of the largest crowds for any launch at the Yale bookstore to date. During the event, Keegan's close friends read excerpts from the collection and discussed the life of their lost friend.
She was a star, she was hilariously funny, she was also heartbreaking. She was edgy, she was cool, she surprised us all every week.
Keegan's family hopes that through the publication of her book, the young writer's legacy will live on and her writing will forever be recognized.
A freshman came up to me and told me that she decided to come to Yale because of The Opposite of Loneliness story, and that somebody said that she should read it, and after she read it, she was convinced this is where she wanted to go. And I thought that was just wonderful.
For YTV, this has been Kevin Kucharski, Kate Walker, and Jack Newsham.
The Boston Globe called Marina's book a keen collection of stories from a light that dimmed too soon. Luckily, that light will forever shine in the pages of this book.
And as always, we leave you with our Everybody Has a Story segment. This week, Cody Pomeran sat down with Yale junior Minami Funakoshi. She has written prolifically about China, and her writings have been published across campus and the world. Here at Yale, she's written for the Yale Globalist and Yale's International Affairs magazine. Professionally, her writing has been seen in Tea Leaf Nation, The Atlantic, the New York Times China, and the Wall Street Journal Asia, where she worked as an opinion intern. Here are a few highlights from that interview.
Hi, welcome to YTV and this week's segment of Everybody Has a Story. Here on this show, we try to bring you the interesting stories of students, professors, and campus guests each week. And this week, one of those students is Saybrook's Minami Funakoshi. The definition of a global citizen, Minami has lived all over Asia, traveled the world, and reported on issues for the Wall Street Journal and The Atlantic. Minami, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So let's start with where you were born. You were born in Japan, you moved to India, back to Japan, then to Malaysia for middle and high school, then back to Japan, and now you find yourself here in New Haven. What do you say when people ask, where are you from?
That was a big issue for me when I came to the US because I don't have an American accent. People ask, where are you from? And I would always hesitate before saying I'm from Japan because I spent half of my life abroad in Malaysia. That's when I started learning English, and now Japanese isn't my strongest language. I find that I'm much more comfortable in English. So for a while I felt like it's not accurate to say I'm Japanese. But I think over the years I came to realize that I am more Japanese than I had thought, and now I just say I'm from Japan.
Now, from what I understand, these questions of national identity became much more serious, even life and death for some people, when you were in China a year ago. Can you talk about what it was like to be there for the anti-Japanese riots?
Sure. So last year I took a year off and was studying in Beijing and Taipei through the Light Fellowship. And I was there beginning June 2012. And in September, the anti-Japan riots broke out in China because Japan nationalized some of the islands in East China Sea that both China and Japan were claiming sovereignty over. And at first, I saw it as a diplomatic issue that wouldn't affect me on a day-to-day basis. And I was at a, job interview targeted at Japanese citizens in China, and I was waiting at the lobby and overheard a group of Japanese people around my age talking about one of their friends who a few days ago had gone to this area of Beijing that's known to have a lot of expats. And she was just walking on the street and a Chinese man approached her and asked, "Where are you from?" She sensed that something was strange. So she lied and said, "I'm from Korea." And the Chinese man said, "Good, if you were Japanese, I would have killed you." And that was the moment when the Japan-China issue became personal and real to me. Like, from that day on, I stopped going to that area of Beijing. I stopped telling strangers on the street, like cab drivers, who would always ask me, "Where are you from?" And before I would just say I'm from Japan and nothing would happen, but I stopped saying that. I said I'm American or Korean or whatever. And I think I was in that state for a month or so, feeling paranoid and scared that someone on the street would somehow recognize that I'm from Japan and start chasing me with a knife. And I knew realistically this wouldn't happen, but given that a lot of Japanese cars owned by Chinese people were being smashed and Japanese factories were lit on fire and Japanese schools and offices closed in China for safety reasons. So I couldn't decide if it was irrational for me to think that way. And so that continued for a while. And after a month or so, I started getting just really claustrophobic, staying in one area of Beijing, not telling people that I'm Japanese. So I started talking to my close Chinese friends about the issue, asking, like, what do you think about all these people? Kind of expressing their anger toward Japan in violent ways. Like, what do you think it's possible to even talk about it? And surprisingly, a lot of my friends were ashamed that there was so much violence going on, and I was able to talk about it openly without feeling threatened. So slowly I expanded the circle and started telling strangers that I met that I'm Japanese again. And one cab driver that I met actually warned me to not advertise that I'm from Japan and was sincerely concerned for my safety. So I think that's when I started writing about China and China-Japan relationship, because I felt like Japanese people definitely have a very one-sided view of China, and Chinese people also have a very set view on Japan. So it's trying to break those stereotypes and talk about what it was like for me as a Japanese citizen to be in China was very cathartic.
Now let's talk about the source of a lot of the tensions, which, as you mentioned, is this island dispute in the East China Sea. On Tuesday, United States Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel made his first official visit to China, and the Chinese defense minister made China's stance abundantly clear, I think, saying, quote, China has indisputable sovereignty over these islands, and that China will, quote, make no compromise, no concession, no treaty, end quote. He also added, quote, the Chinese military can assemble as soon as summoned, fight any battle, and win, end quote. How do you see this issue resolving itself? And do you think that these countries, their leaders, or the people in them actually want to see conflict in the East China Sea?
I think what the Chinese official said about having absolute sovereignty over the island is consistent with what they have said in the past. They say the same thing about the islands in South China Sea, and they've always been saying that the islands in East China Sea are historically part of China. And so in that way, I don't think that the latest statement is any break or sign of escalation. I think about a year ago, there was a real concern for accidental war breaking out because there were so many planes flying through that zone, and although neither country wants war, like they have economic ties that are too strong for that. They can't really survive without one another economically. And I think at some point there was a fear of something happening accidentally, but I think the issue has dragged on for long enough that I think there isn't a high chance of war breaking out. And I think both sides see a return to the status quo as the best option because like neither of them is going to give up the islands, and that ambiguous kind of sharing of, I guess, sovereignty almost has continued for 30, 40 years. And I think if we can somehow go back to that, that would be the best choice for both sides.
So you talk about bridging the gap between China and Japan. The Obama administration has made a concerted effort to make a, quote, pivot towards Asia. What role do you see the United States having in bridging this gap between China and Japan?
I think the United States is definitely in between China and Japan in that it has strong economic ties with both. And recently, Obama has been trying to establish a closer personal connection with Premier Xi Jinping from China. For the first time, I think, in US diplomatic history, the First Lady and their children both visited China for 1 week. And I think that was longer than any other state family visit. And that personal relationship, I think, would help in making sure nothing escalates on China's side. As for Japan, US already has a security treaty with Japan, so if something would happen, if China were to attack Japan, then the US would have to step in on Japan's side. And I think the key for the US on this front is to also ensure that Japan feels that Obama's words have credibility, that if something does happen, US will be on its side. And this balance is difficult to juggle. Like, although Michelle Obama went to China and visited for 1 week, she just announced that she won't be joining Obama's visit to Japan. And there are definitely a lot of ministers in Japan who feel slighted. But somehow maintaining the balance on a personal and diplomatic level between the two would be the best way for the US to bridge the gap.
Minami, Funakoshi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for being here.
And as always, thank you for joining us. For YTV, I'm Cody Pomerantz. See you next time.
To see the full interview, go to the YTV website under the features page.
And that's it for us tonight. We'll see you next Friday at 3 p.m.
For now, we hope you enjoy a few moments from last night's Senior Society TAB festivities.
Thanks for watching. It's your Yale, your week, and your news.
What are you doing, just standing here?
We're supposed to be singing Hakuna Matata.
Can you sing it for me, please?
Yeah. Hakuna Matata, what a wonderful phrase. Hakuna Matata, ain't no passing craze.